persuasive essay is kind of like an argumentative essay. When you think about arguing, what comes to mind? You might think of children fighting for the Wii remote. You might think of friends discussing the pros and cons of Obamacare, or maybe you're thinking of you or another teenager trying to convince your dad to let him borrow the car for the weekend. Do arguments result in a winner and a loser? Do arguers come to a consensus? Are argumentative people those who firmly defend what they believe and never back down? Are arguers people who find ways to compromise? If you consider all of these questions to be the basis for arguing, if you answered yes, then you're right. That is the basis of arguing, with the exception of the first. If you think of two children fighting over a remote control, that's not arguing, that's fighting. And when you start to fight, you stop to think. The best arguments are conceived, presented, and resolved through a balance of feeling and thinking. You don't lose your head in an argument like you would a fight. In a fight, your adrenaline kicks in, and you go toward a person attacking with all of your physical force, and there's not really much in your brain going on except for fight. In an argument, you're calculating, you're reasoning, you're drawing upon the logic and the facts and the evidence that you can find around you and that you can remember. You're recalling from what you have read or learned before and saying, well, I believe this because, and you're using your brain. Knowing how to be a good arguer and becoming a good arguer is going to make you a better thinker. Often, people get angry, they get frustrated when they're presented with something that they don't like or they don't believe in because they don't really know how to defend themselves. Just because they're angry doesn't mean they're right, and it doesn't mean they're wrong. They get angry because they can't represent themselves. They can't represent what they really think or feel about an issue. When you learn the basics of how to have a really good established argument, you're really training yourself how to think better. You're training yourself at better decision making. Sometimes in the process of arguing and doing that research, you discover you may not have been right all along on this. Maybe it's time to tweak what you were thinking or change your mind completely about what you were thinking. And because you have all of these facts at your disposal, you're equipping yourself to be a better decision maker. It will also make you a better writer. Really, good writing is just good thinking. So when you become a better thinker, it lends itself to you becoming a better writer. When you're able to put what you believe and what you think and what you value into sentences that make sense to someone else, and you can support them and prove them in language that makes sense to someone else, you are becoming a better writer. So you first have to be a good thinker, know what you're trying to say, and then say it clearly so that everybody else can understand you. And a lot of that goes into your good grammar, your good punctuation skills, which are the basics of writing. And the other is knowing the nuance, the style, the conversational tone that you want to have. All of those things wrap up into making you a better writer. Arguing also helps you to uncover your own values, assumptions, and beliefs. Like I said, sometimes when you're researching something, you realize you may not have fully realized what you were believing all this time. Now you understand it better. Or now you know you don't quite believe this, you believe this about a certain issue. It will help you develop your reasoning powers. You can think through information. Remember the beginning of your book, you read about deductive and inductive reasoning. It's a good idea for you to go back and read that portion of the introduction to your Siegel reader again and really pay attention more closely to that logic concept. It helps you use emotion without manipulation, and we'll talk more about that. It will also help you distinguish fact versus opinion. It will help you evaluate the evidence. You can't just take what anybody has said and say, here's proof for what I'm thinking because this person also agrees with me. Well, that's not good logic. It's not good reasoning. It's not good evaluating. You have to take what someone else has said and find what that person's proof is, their method of reasoning through that, and find many sources to say the same thing that you're saying or that that person is saying, so that you can say, this person is agreeing with these people who are qualified or who have studied or whatever the case may be. And it will also heighten your sensitivity to language. Language is it's the tool that we have to argue. We either are doing it verbally with our tongues, or we're doing it on paper with basically our fingertips. If we don't have good language ability, then we're not going to have good arguing ability, because you have to say exactly what you mean. So you're always searching for that word that is exactly what you mean to say. You don't want to state something and then someone pick apart what you said because your sentence didn't accurately represent what you really think. And in the end, you emerge on the other side of your paper, your argumentative essay, your persuasive essay, with a sharper mind. Because it's an exercise. It's an exercise in thinking and reasoning and logic. And when you do that, every time you do that, you always come forth sharper, stronger, smarter. So in looking at your persuasive essay, let's look at some principles of argumentation. Argument is bilateral, which means it has more than one side. If it doesn't have more than one side, then it's not really an argument. If I say the sky is blue and I call that a thesis, well, there's no other side to that issue. Anybody who looks up in the sky on a sunny day will see the sky is blue. For something to be argumentative, it has to have more than one side. It has to be open for others to evaluate, examine, agree with, or refute. If someone can't come to your sentence and say, well, no, not quite, because, then it's not an argument. So your thesis has to be stated in a way that is argumentative, that somebody could say there is another point of view on this issue. And it must be open for discussion. If it's not open for discussion, then basically it's a law that you're saying this is now what it is, and there's no arguing with me. And that obviously is not a persuasive essay. Your arguments have to be fair. Opposing parties have a right to be heard. Everybody has a right to be heard, and their opinion really matters. If you're not representing your opposition, then really you're not representing your argument well. In your arguing, you may be proved wrong. You may write your entire persuasive essay, and somebody could take your persuasive essay and write a refutation of it, the same way that you just wrote a refutation of someone else's work. And so in that way, you're kind of opening yourself up to scrutiny, which we'll talk about in a minute. But on the flip side, you may also be proved right. Somebody may take your essay and say, oh yeah, this is true because, and they can write their own reasons, an argument on why your argument is correct. Other parties have a right to be heard because if you don't represent what they have to say, number one, and we'll talk about this in a second, more in depth, it makes you look really arrogant. But two, it also makes you look really stupid, really ignorant, because your readers may think, well, does he know that there's another opinion on this? Or has he read anything at all in the news in the past 10 months? And it makes them question you, it makes them doubt your credibility, and it also makes you look not fair. because you haven't taken the time to look at somebody else's side and say, this person believes this because, and you go back to their basis and say, acknowledge that that basis is something worth accounting for. Your arguments must be substantiated, so you must have convincing support. If you don't have convincing support, there's nothing to your essay. If you don't have someone who's studied on your topic and can say, yes, this is true, and support you, or you don't have logic on your side and you can paint the picture of logic for your reader, then why are they going to believe your argument? You can't just say, human beings can fly, and make this as a statement, and then everybody else say, well, do you mean outside of an airplane or a helicopter? What are you talking about? And you, oh no, I just believe that humans can fly. We may not have figured it out yet, but we can fly. Well, there's no support whatsoever. There's no science that backs you up. There's no logic to back you up. There's no invention to back you up. To just say that human beings, without the help of some other extra equipment, are able to fly. So you have to have some, that's obviously an extreme example, but you have to have some kind of convincing support in order to make a good argument. And that support has to be legitimate factual support. It can't just be opinion, because stating opinions without fact or logic to support them is again arrogant and foolish. Your entire persuasive essay is built on a claim or several claims, so you need to know how to make them. Your claim is your thesis. It's your conclusion or opinion worded as fact, but one that not everyone will agree with. It's a statement that you have to prove as true, and once you state that thesis, the rest of your essay is proving that thesis as true. Your claim should be narrowly focused. It can't be so broad that you can't adequately prove it within your 2,000 word limit. It can't be so broad that it would take you an entire book to prove it, or it would take lawsuits to prove it, or some kind of grandiose procedure in order to prove you right. It has to be narrow enough that you can focus your reader's attention, and so that you have the right support that you can prove this to them in the right amount of time. It has to have an element of controversy, that flip side, the opposing point of view. Here are some examples of claims or thesis. Women are as effective as men in combat. That's the claim. There's a flip side because people could say, no, women are not as effective as men in combat. Here's another one. Animal rights are as important as human rights. Again, there's a contrary point of view because someone can say, no, animal rights are not as important as human rights. Human rights are more important. So you state your claim, and then you support your claim. And remember, back from the beginning introduction to your book, we talked about those 3 Greek words, beginning with ethos, which is your credibility, and trustworthiness. You have to present yourself to your readers as credible. You have to have that support, that research, the honesty, and even in the tone of your writing, a truthfulness that will make your readers respect you. And that in itself will lend to you being trustworthy. The logos is the persuasive, appealing to common sense, and full of evidence. So your tone and the whole point of your paper has to be persuasive, meaning appealing to that common sense, and it has to be full of good evidence that falls back on those facts, statistics, anecdotes, scenarios, and textual evidence. And the last is the pathos, which appeals to emotions, and again, you don't manipulate. A lot of what goes on in the media today is a little bit of manipulation of emotion. We draw upon things like well, let's ban guns because that will end death. You don't want people to die, do you? And it's pulling on your emotions because, no, I don't want people to die, and these mass murders are terrible. That's a pull on your emotions. And that lends itself to being manipulative, although it is not always manipulative. You have to acknowledge and respond to your reader's point of view. Remember, we've said it twice now, they have a right to be heard. Acknowledge the people who disagree with your claim. You have to acknowledge those people. Always acknowledge that there are differing points of view. You aren't attacking the other points of view, you're simply proving your own. As you acknowledge those who disagree with you, accept any part of their argument that might be true or that you recognize as definitely true. Modify your own claim with qualified language. And we'll talk about that in just a couple slides. And then you'll refute your opposition by establishing what is wrong, invalid, or unacceptable. Sometimes your entire essay is a refutation of the opposing argument. And you know that because you just wrote a refutation. So the third point here is modify your claim with qualified language. Well, let's look at what forceful versus qualified language looks like. You want to avoid words like always or never. Women should never be allowed in the military. Well, that's too forceful, because there are instances in which many would argue that women should be allowed in the military. Cats are evil. Well, that's making the statement that all, even though the word all isn't there, it's implied, all cats are evil. And we know that all cats are not evil, even though the majority of them you may feel like are, if you are a dog person. And here's that word again, all. All whatever are whatever. Anytime you say all, you're not opening yourself up to room for error. And it lends you to looking arrogant or foolish, which we talked about before, is something you want to avoid. The word none are susceptible to, none will, and the word absolutely. All of these don't give you any margin of error. It doesn't sound like you have looked at any opposing points of view and that you're trying to force your opinion onto someone else rather than engage in a conversation in which you're trying to prove your point of view. So you want to qualify your claims, your thesis, with words like sometimes, maybe, or might. So sometimes women should not be in combat. That's still an argumentative sentence, but you're immediately putting the opposing view a little bit on softer ground because they don't feel like you're coming at them with hostility, and they don't feel like you're coming at them ignorantly or with a prejudice of some sort. They realize that you acknowledge there are some times that they can be because you use the word sometimes. Many and some. Many cats are evil. Well, here, cat lovers are still going to cringe a little bit. They might even feel a little bit angry that someone would say something like that. But they at least can see that you acknowledge there are some good ones. You're not being too ridiculous about this argument. The same with the word a few and the words probably or possibly. They all qualify your claim and let your opposition know that you know there's another point of view. Your side, you believe, is just better. Reasons readers might dismiss your evidence. Your readers are not going to find you credible if your source is unreliable. If your evidence is inaccurate or insufficient or isn't fair. All of these things are a major deal to your reader. If your source is unreliable, say they Google your source and it comes up as just a blog that some guy on the other side of the country is writing and he doesn't have a degree in what you're arguing for and he's never done anything in the area you're arguing about, well, it's not reliable. Who is he? If it's inaccurate, or it may even be inaccurate because you inaccurately represented it, which is just as much a crime to your reader. If it's insufficient, meaning you have to have enough of it, you can't just have one person agree with you or one instance that agrees with you. You need several proofs to really prove yourself. Again, you've got to be fair. They'll also dismiss you if your evidence is irrelevant. If maybe you've gone on a rabbit trail, or this is a good point, but it doesn't quite prove what you're saying. And the lesson in this is to be scrupulous with your resources and defend them in your essay if necessary. So really dig deep when you're looking at your resources. Really make sure that they're the right people to be proving you and the right proof to be proving you. And by defending them, you'll want to put in sentences like, maybe something like, Dr. Bob Smith, in his book, and name the book, or maybe put his degree title, or say something like, who has counseled patients with depression for the past 25 years. That way, you're defending him. You're saying he has the right to be saying what I'm about to quote from him because he has all this experience, because he has this degree, because so on and so forth. We've been talking all this time about your claims and how to make an argument and the importance of an argument, but one of the most important parts of the entire argument is the warrant. And the warrants are really interesting in an argument because they're never directly stated. Your claim is stated, your support is stated, but the warrant isn't. It's the common ground that you have with your readers that is inherently within your claim. There will be language that hints to that warrant, but never directly stated. It originates with you as the writer and is inherent in your argument, but it's not spelled out in the essay because you want the reader to think that out for himself. You don't want to tell the reader, look, see, we have common ground. You want the reader to come to that on his own because if he thinks, oh, we have common ground, then he's going to be with you and follow you and trust that what you're saying is true, and he's going to think, well, this person has the same basic common ground I do, and therefore I want to know what he has to say. Here are some examples of warrants. You might have a claim or thesis like this. The President of the United States is doing a poor job. Your support? The economy is the worst it's been in 10 years. The unstated warrant in that claim and in that support is this. The president is responsible for the economy. When the economy is weak, it is a sign that the president isn't doing his job. Well, that warrant is what will unite you with your reader. But what if your reader doesn't believe that? If the reader believes that private enterprise and not the president is responsible for improving the economy, he will not accept your claim that the president is doing a bad job just because the economy is poor. So you'll want to think about what these warrants are because this is what makes qualifying your claim so important. You could say the President of the United States is doing a poor job. One reason is that the economy is the worst it's been in 10 years. And you could qualify it by saying, though this is not the only reason a president does a bad job. You're still kind of holding on to that warrant that he is partly responsible for it. And you can show proofs that he is partly responsible for it. And you'll have to show a lot of those proofs. Otherwise, your readers are going to discredit you because they don't have that same warrant. Readers recognize warrants by how the writer presents his information. The writer, you, must anticipate how readers will respond to warrants and account for their responses. That's why in the previous example, with the economy, you would have to find people who support you in your belief that the president does affect the economy in one way or another. Warrants are an essential part of the receipt of an argument. If your readers don't have the same warrants that you do, then they're not going to value your argument at all. They will completely discredit you. So you have to address your warrant very tactfully and not quite on the nose, so that your reader realizes you're coming at this from an angle they can at least understand, even if they don't completely agree with. That doesn't always happen. There are some arguments in which the warrant is just so different from what somebody else believes, it's very hard to have any kind of common ground with them. For example, many times it's very difficult to win an argument that is Bible-based. Because if the person that you're arguing with doesn't believe the Bible is true or valid or the Word of God or the basis for any morality, then you have no warrant if you're basing your claim on the Bible. As you're looking at organizing your persuasive paper, I want to show you two models. The first is one that you saw in your Comp 1 and Comp 2 class. This is the classic model. It's based on the writings of Aristotle, Cicero, and many others, and is the most common academic style. You have your introduction with your attention getter that introduces the topic you're going to talk about, and then ends with that concluding sentence, which is your thesis. You might have a paragraph or two of background information, and most likely you will because you need to get common ground. You'll address the opposition to your argument, and then you'll list your proofs for why you're right. And the bulk of your essay would be those proofs. And then you conclude the argument. That's the basic model. That's the one that you're used to. The new one that we're going to look at today, and the one that I would like you to use for your persuasive essay, is the Rogerian model. This model was designed for arguments with polarizing points of view, with the intent of bringing people together. So basically, this is the kind of argument in which there are two people with such drastic differing points of view, that it's hard to find a common ground for them. That you really can't use the other method of I'm right and you're wrong and here's why, because it will be sure to fall on deaf ears. This method presents common ground for you and your readers. Remember, we're keeping those warrants in mind, and this goes back to immediately putting those warrants at the front of your mind as you're writing the essay. So you start by introducing both sides of an issue. And then, because we're working at getting along, because we're trying to bring this polarized other into the same, basically to a table with you, and you haven't stayed in your corner, you've left your corner, he's left his corner, and you walk to the center of the room and you sit at a table together. And you introduce both sides of the issue, your side and the person who is on the other side of the room. And you make that other side comfortable, as in you're not being abrasive, you're not being hostile, because you validate the opposition. You acknowledge that there is some truth to what they have to say, and that really you might be coming from the same ground, the same point of view. You're just acting upon it differently. So you present your viewpoint. And in conclusion, you'll recommend a compromise. This is the model that I would like you to use for your persuasive essay. Use the essay that you'll be reading for your homework this week, How We All Missed the Point on School Shootings, as a model for what I would like you to do. You're going to introduce two sides of an issue, or maybe several sides of an issue. In How We All Missed the Point, he addresses that every time there's a shooting, there are people who say, well, let's ban guns. There are people who say, We need to look more into homes and make sure children have better family lives. And there are people who say, and he lists the opposing points of view. Then he introduces his viewpoint, which you'll have to read to find out. And in the end, he recommends a compromise for how we can deal with this. It might even end with an urgency for how we can deal with this. So go ahead and read How We All Miss the Point on School Shootings. And that will also be the topic for your forum, which will be good for getting your brain juices going, your creativity going. And then you'll be writing your own persuasive essay following that model. And as always, if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email.